Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. There is a kind of forgetting that is not unkind. It does not arrive with sudden violence, the way a door is slammed or a name erased from a ledger. It comes instead, the way dusk comes to a narrow lane in late winter, slowly, without announcement, settling into the corners first, then the windows, then the spaces between the cobblestones where moss has learned to live in the absence of footsteps. It comes the way snow comes, which is to say, it comes as if it has always been coming, as if the world beneath it was always meant to be covered and quiet. And still Wych Elm Lane had been forgotten in precisely this way. It lay at the edge of the older part of the city, where the streets still followed the logic of another century, narrow and crooked, answering to the shape of the land rather than the demands of a plan. The lane was no wider than two men standing with their arms outstretched, its cobblestones worn smooth by 100 years of feet, its terraced cottages pressed together on either side like books, leaned close on a shelf. There were 8 cottages in all, 4 to a side, their doors painted in colours that had once been distinct. A red, a green, a blue, so dark it was nearly black, but that the years had softened into a common, gentle grey, the way all strong things are eventually softened by time and weather, and the patient indifference of the sky. Most of the windows were dark now. They held the winter light the way old mirrors hold a reflection dimly without warmth, giving back only the grey of the clouds and the bare branches of the great wych elm that stood at the lane's far end, its ancient trunk wider than Silas's arm span, its branches reaching upward into the fading afternoon, with the patience of something that has learned to wait without expecting. The elm was bare, as it always was in February, its bark the colour of old pewter, its smallest branches fine as hair against the pale sky. It had been there longer than the cottages, longer perhaps than the lane itself. It stood as a kind of witness, not judging, but present in the way that very old things are present, simply, completely, as if presence itself were enough. The snow had begun to fall some time in the early afternoon, in small, unhurried flakes that lay along the window-sills and gathered in the hollows of the elm's bark, and dusted the shoulders of Silas's coat as he moved slowly up the lane, his broom in hand. The sound of the broom was the lane's heartbeat. It had been the lane's heartbeat for 70 years. Silas moved with the deliberateness of a man who has learned that speed is no virtue when there is nowhere pressing to be. He was 81 years old, though he did not think of his age often, and when he did, it was without alarm, as one thinks of the weather as a condition of the day, neither welcome nor unwelcome, simply present. He was tall still, though the years had curved his shoulders slightly forward. His hands on the broom handle were weathered, the knuckles large, the skin thin and mapped with the small tributaries of a long life of outdoor work. His face was clean-shaven and lined, the lines of a man who had spent much of his life looking at things carefully enough to love them without needing to say so. He wore his heavy coat, the one with the wooden buttons that his wife Margaret had sewn on fresh 30 years ago, 30 years, and still they held. His scarf was wound twice around his neck. He wore his flat cap pulled low, and above its brim the snow settled in a thin white line, as if the sky were marking him as one of its own. He had lived on Wych Elm Lane since he was 11 years old. His family had moved into number 7 in the spring of 1955. He remembered the smell of it, of new wallpaper and old stone, and the faint sweetness of wych elm blossoms drifting through the open window of what would be his room. His mother had stood at the lane's entrance and looked down its length and said, "Well, it is a proper little street, isn't it?" And his father had agreed, and Silas had said nothing because he was 11 and had no words yet for what he felt, which was that the lane was exactly the right size. Not too wide, not too busy, not too loud. It was a place that a boy could know completely, and knowing completely seemed to him at 11 the most important thing in the world. He had never left. The families had gone one by one over the years, moved away to better neighbourhoods, to houses with gardens and room for children to run in, or moved away in the final and permanent sense that the very old move away, the curtains drawn, the door closed quietly behind them. The landlord, who had owned most of the cottages, had died without an heir, the properties passing into legal limbo long enough that the various authorities had apparently decided Wych Elm Lane was more trouble than it was worth, and left it to its own quiet devices, which meant they had left it to Silas. No one had asked him to maintain the lane or written his name in any ledger as responsible for its upkeep. He simply did it, as he had always done it, because it was the lane, and it was there, and it needed doing, and he was the one who was still there to do it. He swept the steps of each cottage in turn. He began at number 1, nearest the lane's entrance, and worked his way down. 4 cottages on the left-hand side, then crossing to number 8 at the far end, and working back up the right-hand side to his own cottage at number 7, which he swept last, saving his own for the end, the way you save what you love best. The steps at number 1 were 2 shallow risers of stone, worn concave in the centre where 60 years of feet had pressed them. He swept them with the same attention he had always given them, angling the broom into the corner where the step met the door frame, where the snow was beginning to collect in a thin white seam. He paused a moment at the door. He always paused a moment at each door. It was not a conscious ritual. It had simply happened gradually, the way all the true habits of his life had happened, not chosen but arrived at, like a path worn into grass by repeated footfall until it becomes the only natural way through. He stood before the grey door of number 1 and let the silence settle around him, and in the silence there was the memory of the Prentice family, who had lived there until 1987, 2 parents and 3 daughters, the daughters noisy and full of laughter, the mother given to growing herbs on the windowsill, thyme and rosemary, and a small stubborn sage that had grown wild up the cottage wall until the cold finally took it 3 winters ago. He moved on to number 2. The snow fell in patient silence. At number 2 he thought of old Mr. Carver, who had lived alone for the last 12 years of his life, and who had come to Silas's door every Sunday morning. to share a pot of tea and talk about cricket. Mr. Carver had died at 94 with his windows clean, because Silas had cleaned them, and his steps swept, because Silas had swept them, and Silas had been the one to ring for the ambulance, and the one to tell the council, and the one to see that the door was locked properly afterward. There had been no one else to do it. That was often the way of things on Wych Elm Lane. At the end, at number 3, Silas swept carefully around the cracked corner of the second step. The crack that had appeared 3 winters ago, and that he had filled with good stiff mortar. Not perfectly, not invisibly, but solidly enough that it would not worsen. He had not asked anyone's permission. He had simply done it because a cracking step was a step moving toward ruin, and ruin on Wych Elm Lane was something he could not stand by and watch. At number 4, the last on the left-hand side, the one whose door had once been a deep, dark green, he paused longest. Number 4 had been the Almeida house, Rosa and Daniel, and their son Paulo, who still exchanged Christmas cards with Silas from somewhere in Lisbon. Rosa had baked on Thursdays, the smell of it drifting through the lane all morning, sweet and warm and entirely welcoming. She had been the last to leave, after Daniel died, and Paulo came and took her gently but firmly north, telling her she was too old to be living alone on a lane that nobody else lived on any more. She had stood in the lane with her cases and looked back at her cottage, and then at Silas and said, "You'll keep an eye on it, won't you, Silas?" And he had said, "I will, Rosa," and she had nodded as if that were sufficient guarantee, which, he supposed it was. He had kept an eye on it. He had kept an eye on all of them. He crossed the lane and swept the return journey. Numbers 8 and 6 and 5, each one attended to with the same unhurried care, each one carrying its own quiet inventory of memory. He saved number 7 for last. His own steps were no different from the others. It would not have seemed right to sweep the others carefully, and his own carelessly, any more than it would have seemed right to favour one's own children in matters of justice. The lane was the lane, all of it. He stood at his own door when it was done and looked back up the length of the lane. The snow was falling more steadily now. The flakes larger than they had been an hour. The cobblestones were beginning to show the first thin whitening, the snow finding purchase in the grooves between the stones. The empty windows held the last of the afternoon's grey light, and the lane was very quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of fullness, of something that has been tended so long and so faithfully that it has become a kind of presence in itself. He should have gone inside then. The cold was sharpening, and his knees had been protesting for the last hour. Instead, he turned and walked slowly to the far end of the lane. He was not sure why. Afterward, he went to the elm sometimes in the evenings, to stand under its branches for a few minutes before returning. He had done it all his life, in all seasons. In spring, when the elm's small flowers opened, an unremarkable bloom most people walked past without noticing. In summer, when its canopy cast a dappled shade. In autumn, when its papery winged seeds covered the cobblestones in a layer of soft brown lace. And in winter like this, when it stood bare and patient and entirely itself against the grey, he walked toward it through the thickening snow, his broom over his shoulder, his breath coming in small clouds that dissolved into the cold air behind him. He was perhaps 3 steps from the great trunk when he saw it. It was at the base of the tree, in the hollow where 2 of the elm's surface roots rose from the ground and curved back down again, making a kind of low, natural cradle in the earth. He had walked past that hollow 10,000 times. He knew its shape the way he knew the shape of his own hands. There had been nothing there this morning. He was certain of it, as certain as a man can be of anything he has attended to daily for 7 decades. But there was something there now, a box. It was small, no larger than his hand, no larger than the kind of box a jeweller might use. It was made of wood, a pale, smooth-grained wood, and tied around it was a length of ribbon, faded red. The colour red goes when it has been kept somewhere for a long time, and the light has worked on it gently, softening it to something that remembered red without quite being it any more. Silas stood and looked at it for a moment. He was not a man given to startlement. 81 years had provided ample practice in receiving what came without excessive reaction. He looked at the box as he looked at everything, carefully, completely letting the looking do its work before he moved or reached. Then he went to it. His knees made their opinion known as he lowered himself down. One hand on the elm's trunk for balance, the rough bark cool and familiar under his palm, the snow that had gathered in its furrows damp against his fingers. He crouched rather than fully kneeled. The compromise his knees and his stubbornness had long since arrived at, and he reached out and picked up the box. It was warm. That was the first thing he noticed. The air was 3 or 4 degrees above freezing. The ground was cold. The elm's bark was cold. Everything was cold. But the wood of the box was warm. Not dramatically warm, but warm in the way that something is warm when it has been recently held, when human hands have given it their heat, and the heat has stayed. The wood was smooth, worn in the particular way of things that have been handled many times, over many years, smooth with use, with the slow buffing of repeated touch, the way a banister is smooth, or a much-loved tool handle, or the spine of a book read 50 times. He looked at the ribbon, faded red, tied in a bow simple, careful, neither elaborate nor sloppy, the kind of bow tied by someone who wanted it to hold, but also to be opened, who had thought about both the tying and the untying in the same moment. He took the end of the ribbon between his thumb and forefinger and pulled gently, and the bow came undone as easily as if it had been waiting for exactly this. He folded the ribbon carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He opened the box. The lid hinged back on a small brass fitting, and inside, on a bed of dried moss. The moss was grey-green and faintly fragrant, the kind of scent that is barely a scent at all, more a suggestion of earth and winter and growing things at rest. It had been dried carefully, not crumbled but intact, laid in a thin, even layer on the floor of the box, like a small, precise meadow. On this bed, nestled as if placed with great attention, were 2 things. The first was a key. It was small, perhaps as long as his thumb from knuckle to tip, and old, very old, in the way that keys are old when the metal has gone beyond tarnish into something darker and more permanent, a patina that is no longer a surface quality but part of the thing itself. It was the kind of key made for a warded lock, with a simple round bow and a long shank and a single toothed bit at the end. The kind of key that belonged to a door that no longer existed, or perhaps to a door that had always existed, only as a door, as the idea of a threshold, as the thing you carry to remind yourself that somewhere there is something worth entering. He picked it up. It was cool and lighter than he expected, and in his large, weathered hand it looked very small and very old and very exact. The second thing was a piece of paper. It was folded twice in half, and then in half again, thick and slightly cream-coloured, the kind that takes a pen well. He unfolded it with the care he gave to everything, and he held it up in the fading light, and he read it 7 words. For the one who has kept us all. He read it again, for the one who has kept us all. He stood at the base of the elm, and he stood with the box in one hand, and the note in the other, and the key resting in the box on its bed of dried moss. And he read the words a 3rd time, which was not because he had failed to understand them, but because understanding sometimes requires a 3rd reading, the way certain rooms require a 3rd entry before you truly know them. Then he walked slowly to the low stone wall that ran along the lane's edge, just beside the elm's outermost roots, a wall that had been there as long as the lane itself, that served no practical purpose anyone could now identify, but that was part of the lane's grammar, and therefore part of its necessity. And he sat down on it slowly, and he let the snow fall around him, and he held the box on his knees and the note in his hands, and he thought, the one who has kept us all. He did not know who had left the box. He understood, sitting there, that he was not meant to know. This was not a thing left carelessly, but a thing left with great intention, and part of the intention was the not knowing, a deliberate, honourable withholding, the way the snow withholds the ground without destroying it, keeping it safe beneath itself until spring. He thought of the families, of the prentice daughters, who had grown up on the lane and scattered, one to Bristol, one to Canada, one to the world, and who perhaps remembered the narrow street where they had learned to ride their bicycles, the steps their father had stood on to call them in for tea. He wondered if one of them remembered that there had always been a man who swept those steps and kept the windows whole, and was simply there, so reliably present that presence itself became a kind of comfort. He thought of Mr. Carver and his cricket stories and his habit of arriving exactly at 10 on Sunday mornings, never at 5 to 10 or 5 past, always exactly at 10, as if he had been practicing punctuality all his life and had finally perfected it. He thought of Rosa Almeida and her Thursday baking, and the way she had looked back at her cottage when Polo came to take her away, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of careful inventory, committing it to memory with the thoroughness of someone who knows they are seeing a thing for the last time. He thought of Margaret often, but differently now than he had in the first years after her death, when the thought of her had been an ache that accompanied everything, every cup of tea every morning, every time he swept the steps and came back into the cottage to no one. The ache had not gone away. He did not believe it ever entirely went away, but it had deepened into a different kind of presence, less an absence and more a continuity, as if she were simply in another room of the same house. He thought of what it meant to keep. He had never thought of himself as a keeper. He had swept the steps, because the steps needed sweeping. He had repaired the crack in number 3, because a cracking step moves toward ruin, and ruin was not something the lane deserved. He had checked the windows, because windows left unattended admit the weather, and the weather admitted unmakes things. He had paused at each door because, well, he had simply paused. But now, sitting on the wall with the snow settling on his shoulders and his cap and the backs of his hands, he understood that keeping had been precisely what he had done, and that it was a more exact word than any he might have chosen for himself. He had kept the lane's physical fabric, the steps, the windows, the walls, but he had also kept something else. He had kept the prentice daughter's childhood by keeping the steps their father stood on. He had kept Mr. Carver's dignity by keeping his windows clean in those last years, when Mr. Carver's own hands had not been steady enough. He had kept Rosa Almeida's investment of love in her cottage by not letting it fall into the indifference that empty buildings fall into when no one attends them. He had kept all of them in the only way available to him, which was by keeping the physical evidence of their having been here, by maintaining the stage on which they had lived, even after they were gone from it. A keeping of memory, then not by writing things down, not by telling stories — he was not a storyteller, had never been — but by the daily physical act of showing up and attending to what they had left behind, by making their absence honoured rather than neglected, by treating the empty houses as if the families were simply away for the afternoon, and would return to find their steps clean and their windows whole and the lane in good order. The key in the box did not open anything. He understood that fully. It was a symbol in the deeper sense, a thing that stands for what cannot be directly said, that holds in its small metal form a meaning too large for explanation. The key stood for the kept, for all the thresholds he had tended without crossing, all the doors he had swept before without opening, all the lives he had preserved the shape of while letting them remain closed and private and their own. For the one who has kept us all, Simone had understood. He did not need to know who. It was enough, more than enough, that someone had, that somewhere, in the years of his tending, someone had seen what he was doing and had understood it and had wanted him to know. That was all. That was more than he had ever expected. That was, he thought, sitting on the cold stone wall in the falling snow, more than most people receive in a long life of doing what needs doing without being asked. The snow fell in patient silence. He sat a while longer, not from indecision, but from the desire to sit, to be still in this place for a few more minutes, to let the moment settle into him the way snow settles into the grooves between cobblestones. Then he folded the note along its original creases and placed it back in the box beside the key on its bed of dried moss. He closed the lid, retrieved the ribbon from his coat pocket, and tied it back around the box. His bow was not as neat as the original. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but it held, and the faded red lay across the pale wood like a small, patient gesture. He tucked the box carefully into his coat pocket. It fit precisely as if the pocket had been made for it, and picked up his broom and laid his free hand on the elm's trunk for a moment. The bark was rough under his palm, cool and real, the living wood beneath it solid, and present under the cold surface. Then he walked back up the lane. His cottage was warm. He had banked the fire before going out, and he built it up now with 2 pieces of ash from beside the hearth, the wood burning clean and steady. He set the kettle on the hob and unwound his scarf and hung his coat on the hook by the door and took off his cap. He took the box from his coat pocket before he hung the coat. He held it for a moment, feeling the smooth warmth of the wood, the slight weight of it in his large hand. Then he carried it to the mantel. The mantel was pale grey stone, the same stone as the lane's cobbles, quarried from the same ground centuries ago, and on it were arranged the things he kept there. The clock, which had stopped at 3:10 on the 14th of March, 20 years ago, and which he had never wound again, not from sentimentality, but from a sense that some things, having stopped, should be allowed to remain stopped. Beside the clock, the photograph, Margaret at 45 in the lane, squinting slightly against the summer sun, her hand raised to shade her eyes, her expression suggesting she found the whole business of being photographed faintly absurd, which she had. And now beside the photograph, between the clock and Margaret, the box. He set it down carefully, squaring it up, centering it, the way he centered everything he placed anywhere. The faded red ribbon lay across the pale wood. The box sat on the grey stone between the stopped clock and the photograph of his wife and looked, he thought, as if it had always been there, as if the space between the clock and Margaret had always been exactly the right size for this. He made his tea a full pot. As always, a single cup was a concession to efficiency he had never seen the need to make. He poured the water over the leaves and left it to draw for 3 minutes by some internal measure that 70 years of tea making had made as reliable as any instrument. He carried his cup to the chair by the window. The chair was old, upholstered in fabric that had once been dark red and was now a warm faded brown, the seat holding the shape of him with the accommodating fidelity of something long used. He sat in it and was entirely at home. He looked out at the lane. The snow was falling thickly now, still without wind, but generously in the way that a long-established kindness is generous, matter of factly and without demonstration. The cobblestones were fully white now, the grooves between them invisible, the lane a single smooth surface of snow, unbroken, unmarked. His footprints from the afternoon's sweeping had been covered over, and there was no trace left of his passage, which seemed right. The lane was not about the traces of passing, it was about the passing itself, the daily return, the faithfulness beneath the surface. The empty windows held the last grey light, beautiful in their way, the beauty of well-kept absence, of emptiness that has been honoured, of the shape of a thing maintained against the pressure of time and weather and forgetting. The great elm was barely visible through the falling snow, a dark shape at the lane's end, patient and upright, its bare branches softened by the white, until the tree looked less like a winter tree, and more like a sketch of one, an impression of itself gentle and exact. The fire settled in the grate behind him with a soft sound, a small collapse that released a new bloom of heat, and the room was warm and smelled of wood smoke and tea and the faint, clean scent of cold air that had come in with him, and was now releasing itself, warming by degrees, becoming part of the room's air. On the mantel, The box sat between the stopped clock and Margaret. The key inside rested on its bed of dried moss, and the note beside it held its 7 words, and neither the key nor the note required anything further from him. They were complete. He had received the gift and placed it where it belonged. That was the whole of what was asked. The box had not arrived as a mystery to be solved. It had arrived as a gift, precise and particular, scaled to the size of what he had given over 70 years, and he had received it as it was given quietly, and with the full weight of his attention. He held his cup of tea with both hands. The warmth spread through his fingers, stiff from the afternoon's cold, and he let the warmth do its work, which was simply to warm, and the warming was sufficient. He thought, without words, of all the years, not a catalogue. His mind did not run to catalogue, but a sense of them, a feeling of their accumulated weight and texture, the way a landscape has a feeling when you have walked it long enough. The lane in all its seasons, the families in all their stages, the elm in all its years. His own hands changed and unchanged Margaret. The stopped clock, the slow daily work of sweeping steps that no one walked on any more, honouring the absent with the same attention he would have given the present, because the absent had been present, and presence once real does not entirely cease. He was the keeper of Wych Elm Lane. He had always known this, not in words, not as a declared identity, but as a fact of the body, as natural and unexamined as breathing. But he had not known until today that the keeping had been seen, that somewhere in the years of his tending someone had looked at what he was doing and understood what it was. The one who has kept us all, not the lane alone, not the buildings, but us all, the families, the children, the lovers walking in the evening light, the old men who had died with their windows clean because someone had cleaned them, the old women who had looked back at their cottages from the lane's end and known that the steps would be swept tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because he would be here. He had kept them. The keeping, he was very tired now, a tiredness that was not unpleasant, the tiredness that comes at the end of a day that has been full in the right way. He held his cup loosely as his eyes settled on the lane, the white lane, the dark windows, the elm barely visible through the snow, and his chair held him in its old familiar way, and the fire breathed behind him with its soft, constant warmth. The box on the mantel caught the firelight. The pale wood held it warmly, the way wood holds warmth, differently from metal, differently from stone, with a kind of willingness that other materials lack, and the faded red ribbon glowed in it, the colour remembering its former brightness for a moment. For this one moment in the firelight of this particular evening, the key inside would be warming too. The note with its 7 words, the whole small interior of the box, warming in the light of his fire, as if it had come a long way to find it. The lane was entirely white now. There were no footprints, no marks, no evidence of any passage. The snow had covered everything with its patient, thorough generosity, and the lane lay under it, as it had lain under every winter he could remember, quietly, completely, with the absolute stillness of something that has been well tended and knows it. The elm was a shadow in the white. the empty windows, held the dark. Silas slept. He slept in his chair as he often slept on winter evenings, his head tilting slowly to one side, his breathing deepening by degrees, the cup still loosely held in the hands that had swept steps and repaired cracks and lifted boxes from root, hollows and tied ribbons, and carried the daily unannounced weight of a life of keeping. He slept the way the lane slept, not in the suspended tension of waiting, but in the settled peace of completion, of a work done and acknowledged, still ongoing even in sleep, because the keeping does not stop when the keeper rests. It inheres in the things kept. It lives in the clean steps and the whole windows and the repaired crack and the empty houses that are not neglected but honoured, their absence attended to with the same daily faithfulness as presence would have required. The box on the mantel watched over him. Its key rested on its bed of dried moss, waiting for no door, requiring no lock, complete in itself, as all true gifts are complete. Not because they resolve what is unresolved, but because they see what is already there and say so. The snow fell on Wych Elm Lane in patient, unhurried silence. It fell on the cobblestones, and the steps and the sills of the dark windows, and the bare branches of the ancient elm, and the low stone wall beside the elm's roots, where the impression of a seated figure had been, briefly, in the snow, and was covered over now and gone. The lane lay under its white blanket as it had always lain, tended and still, the keeper and the kept resting together in the long and gentle dark. The keeper watched over, at last, by the very place he had kept, the two of them holding one another in the falling snow, in the firelight, in the quiet that had no end.